Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today. We're very excited to be partnering with She and Finney to give this presentation on this very, very timely topic right now. We want to thank them so much for their sponsorship and for generously providing this great info for you all to watch today. We are recording this webinar, so for those who registered, you will receive a recorded video afterwards. You can also, since you're here live right now, submit questions during the event. To do that, you're going to move your mouse or tap your screen. You're going to see a button called Q&A pop up. Just click on that, and from there you can simply type in your questions. It will only be seen by our presenters here today. You can ask anonymously, so please feel free throughout, you can submit questions. There will be time dedicated to questions near the end, but you can submit them at any time. So again, click on Q&A and simply type in your question. So with that, I want to introduce Jason Gregoire. Did I say that right? I don't know.
You got it.
All right. And Jim Reedy will be here in a few minutes. Thank you so much for being here today, Jason.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. It's really a pleasure to be here. Really excited to be partnering with the Chamber. And apologies for Jim being a little late. He got stuck in an accident. He's not in an accident, but there's an accident on the road. So he will be here soon. And if not, we'll get through it. So I'm Jason Gregoire. I'm chair of the health care group at She and Finney, and we're really excited to be here today. Thanks for having us. So the topic is, can employers require their employees to get the COVID-19 vaccine, and issues to consider? And there's a lot of them. So today we're briefly going to talk through, update on the virus and vaccine distribution in New Hampshire, and then the $1 million question, or maybe more, can employers mandate the vaccine for employees? Does the answer to that question depend on what type of employer you are? Does that answer depend on what type of employees you have and their job functions? We'll talk through consent requirements, answer the question, what if an employee objects to the vaccine due to medical or religious reasons? Talk through some alternatives, industry best practices, and then we will leave plenty of time for Q&A. So please submit your questions as we work through the webinar today. Okay, so as you know, unfortunately, COVID-19 infections, hospitalizations, and deaths have been on the rise nationally and here in New Hampshire. Most states have responded by rolling back the relaxed standards that they put into effect over the summer and have implemented new restrictions. We're now about a month into distribution of the vaccines, which is crazy because when Jim and I started doing these webinars, we were talking about the FDA hopefully approving a vaccine through an EUA. As of yesterday, I was looking at the New York Times last night, and I saw that recent surveys still indicate that almost 50% of those polled are uncertain whether they will get the vaccine. I think the statistic was like 36% last month said that they would get it and they wanted it immediately. As of yesterday, it was up to 47%. But still, that's half the country that's still uncertain about whether they're going to get it. So with so much uncertainty from people saying, I don't know if I'm going to get it, employers have asked, well, what if I want to require my employees to get the vaccine? And that's what we're here to talk about today. So as you probably heard, vaccine light at the end of the tunnel. We'll give just a quick history as you've probably seen it play out and you've read in the papers. On December 11th, Pfizer was the first manufacturer of a COVID-19 vaccine to get an FDA emergency use authorization. So that's a temporary approval, not a full approval, but that was a big step in order to get this vaccine out. As you've probably read in the papers, the FDA's approval for the Pfizer vaccine and Moderna's vaccine is approved for use of people over the ages of 16. So there's a lot of testing going on relating to or trials going on with regard to children right now. So we'll see what happens as time goes on. On December 14th, Pfizer vaccine started being shipped. December 18th, Moderna's vaccine was approved by the FDA. And there's a couple more in the pipeline, including AstraZeneca. since there was enough, as you all know, there wasn't enough vaccine on day one to vaccinate everybody. So DHHS put together a vaccine administration priority plan. That's on the DHHS website. You can find it, you can read it, and we'll give you some highlights here. We're in, actually, if you can move to the next slide, Emily, we'll talk through the different phases. So right now we're in phase 1B. Phase 1A was vaccinating essential healthcare workers, those that work in long-term care settings, hospitals, and first responders. Many of you probably saw on social media, friends and family members getting their first vaccine and holding up their little vaccination card with a big look of excitement. So it's really inspiring to see. Phase 1B, you've seen in the papers and on the news, if you're 65 or older, or if you have certain healthcare conditions that put you at risk, you can register now. I think 200 or 1,000 or so people registered earlier this week in order to get an appointment. So we'll see how that rolls out. Governor Sununu was on the news last night saying he expects that we're going to get more vaccines, and there's been a bunch of federal press about the Biden administration really pushing hard to get increased production from the federal government. After, facilitated by the federal government, more production by the vaccine manufacturers. Phase 2 will be school teachers and staff, childcare workers, and folks, those that work in homeless shelters, group homes, prisons, etc. And then after that, there's a sort of amorphous group of adults, children, workers, and occupations important to the function of society, or those at increased risk of exposure. I assume we'll get some further guidance on that. And finally, the final group is everybody else, myself included. As we just talked about, there's still a lot of uncertainty around how much people, how many people want to get vaccinated. Do you want it? Do you not want it? When we first started doing this webinar, the numbers looked like maybe 100 million Americans could be vaccinated by March 2021. I'm not so sure we're going to reach that number at this point. And even among healthcare workers, there's still a lot that are opting out. And as you've heard Dr. Fauci and others say, we're going to need about 70 to 80% of Americans vaccinated before we reach, herd immunity. I think even then there's questions about, are we going to be able to take off our masks and return to normal? Hoping for summer or early fall 2021, but it's a big question mark at this point, which makes the questions we're going to talk about in terms of mandatory vaccination even more important. If Jim, I'm not sure if you're available to speak, but I can certainly take this slide if you are.
I'm here, Jay.
Hi, Jim.
Good morning, everyone. So the question, of course, as Jay set up, is whether or not the federal government can mandate the vaccination. So just like the federal government is considering a mask mandate, can they mandate that individuals receive the vaccine? And the short answer to that is no, there's no precedent for that. I mean, the OSHA 2014 pandemic guide talks about offering or encouraging the vaccine, but there's no precedent whatsoever. Now, again, how many pandemics have we looked at over the course of, let's say, the last 100 years? And really the last one really to look at would be the Spanish flu of 1917. Well, there was no vaccine and there was no capacity for the distribution of the vaccine. So we're really in uncharted territories. Now, EEOC, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has taken the position with regard to other vaccines, particularly flu, H1N1 more particularly, which was bird flu and SARS, that a vaccine may be necessary in some jobs. And that's sort of where they're coming down with their most recent guidance. But even then, even if a vaccine is mandated, the employee may be able to opt out for medical, disability, or religious reasons. So how about the state government? Can the state government mandate a vaccine? And Jay and I have worked on that over the last couple of years before COVID. And the issue came down to healthcare workers in hospitals, daycare, residential care facilities, long-term care, assisted living, and so on, they can be required to receive a flu shot or present immunization records like MMR, Hep C, and so on. Why? Well, it's under a state law, but I mean, it makes perfect sense that you would want to have a situation where those caring for and are patient facing themselves have the titers or immunity, so they're not spreading the virus to those that are most susceptible. Again, however, under that state law, there could be exceptions. And we've had that case, Jay and I have, with regard to a couple of hospitals where someone said, I have a sincerely held religious belief that keeps me from getting a vaccine, or I've got medical reasons where the medications I'm taking, or because of certain physical disabilities, I can't take the vaccine. Then a decision has to be made. So in December 11th, the FDA issued, of course, as we know, and Jay set this up, the guidance with regard to the Pfizer vaccine, the emergency use authorization. And that was temporary approval, but not full vaccine licensure. And what does that mean? Well, there are certain guidance that go along with that EUA. But of course, that was welcome news for all of us. But with that, the question was whether or not, okay, we've gone from federal government to state government to employers. Can employers mandate the vaccine? Well, in the first instance, the FDA talked about to ensure that recipients of the vaccine understand what they're getting, that they have to accept or refuse the vaccine, meaning they have the opportunity to opt out. And that's based upon informed consent, meaning they receive something in advance that tells them, here are the expected benefits of the vaccine, and here are the possible side effects. And that's something that is required, that comes from the EUA. That setup, though, then gets to the December 16th guidance. And as Jay said, that's something that as we were preparing a few months ago, and we're looking at this issue, that was welcome guidance from EEOC. Now, we had already suggested in articles that we had written and guidance we'd given to clients based upon the things I talked about earlier with regard to the way in which vaccines could be required in certain jobs, that the EEOC would come down this way, and thankfully they did. Hospitals, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, healthcare agencies certainly can, and perhaps even schools certainly can require employees to get the vaccine. And it isn't, the guidance in December 16th was not limited to just those entities, but certainly those are the ones that come up front of mind with regard to those employers that can require it for good reason. However, going back to the EUA, but also going back to earlier precedent, even those employers who are able to mandate the vaccine have to be able to accommodate those who cannot take it or that properly adopt out. So the guidance says it has to be, meaning the mandate has to be job related and consistent with business necessity. And like any other law or regulation, the recipient is sort of left scratching their head, says, what does that mean? And there's also language that talks about if to determine if the employee's refusal or failure to get the vaccine represents a direct threat to himself or herself, or to coworkers or to others in the workplace. And what does that mean? Well, the direct threat analysis comes from the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it's not unique to that. But it's largely, that's where we see where the definition is. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But in general, direct threat means that it is a direct and imminent threat of physical harm to himself or herself in the job, coworkers or others that he may come into contact with if they are not vaccinated. So in healthcare settings, schools, and so on, you may be automatically required to get the vaccine. However, if you refuse on the basis of medical, religious, or disability reasons, there should be perhaps at least a discussion, not an automatic accommodation, but a discussion whether or not there is a reasonable accommodation, meaning is there an alternative to be considered rather than the vaccine? And you need to proceed with caution in that regard as you're going through that exchange of information, which is required, that you don't elicit information about the person's impairments or current health status that's not relevant to the discussion. That comes from the December 16th guidance from the EEOC. And what that does is that tiptoes through the analysis that you typically find in the ADA that talks about when you exchange information with employees and you talk about things that are job related, the essential functions of the job and so on, be careful to focus just in that area and that you don't drift into other areas that you don't need to be discussing.
Yeah, and Jim, just if I can jump in real quick, I think there's an interesting discussion going on right now about reasonable accommodation, because the question we're getting a lot, as you know, is, well, my employees have been working with masks or PPE, since March. Why is that not a reasonable accommodation? So I think for now, a lot of employers seem like, depending on, again, the nature of the job functions, they've been letting people continue to work with masks. But once we get full vaccine licensure and we're moving toward herd immunity, I'd be very interested to see how that analysis changes.
Yeah, and Jay, as of yesterday, I had several calls with different clients, but that are considering or have already mandated the vaccine. And when they've got some employees, and we'll talk about the different refusals and how to proceed. Some said, well, I've been wearing a mask and using other forms of PPE, whether it's gowns, gloves, even goggles, and why isn't that enough? Well, if you balance the efficacy of PPE versus the vaccine,
right,
we know that going back to Dr. Fauci and others, that one mask may not be enough. In fact, as recently as yesterday, Dr. Fauci talking about 2 masks possibly. And so if it's a difference between a mask or other forms of PPE and the vaccine clearly, at least the science today says, is far more effective at shielding someone from getting or transmitting the disease. So, but as Jay said, it comes down to the job, and you have to make and that's an important point. You must make a determination based upon each circumstance. You can't say generally, well, this is what we do. It has to be unique to that particular job and circumstance. And when it gets to the individual, talking about a physical or medical disability or impairment, it has to be unique to that person and that impairment. So other legal issues associated with the mandate, if it's coming through a third party, meaning the vaccine's coming through a third party, working with the employer to provide the vaccine, and we've actually had several clients already that one yesterday I was dealing with the housing authority, that they are facilitating, they're not mandating the vaccine, but they're facilitating it, having an on-site vaccination available and offered to employees and residents. You have to be careful in that regard that they're basically following the same rules that you would follow should you be administering the vaccine on premises yourselves or requiring yourselves. Again, employees who refuse the vaccine, this is the accommodation analysis that Jay referred to. Some of the options are being relieved of duty or furloughed, transferred to another department that, or segregated from the at-risk population, or required to work remotely. But the employer cannot retaliate against the employee for refusing the vaccine. Now, again, that's a tightrope issue, because the question is, well, there's no accommodation here because you represent that direct threat. So therefore, you can't work here anymore, or you can't work here until such time that we reach that magic herd immunity. And is that a form of retaliation? Right now, the answer is no, but you have to be careful that indeed you've gone through that analysis, that it truly is a job requirement consistent with business necessity. Again, whether it is mandated or voluntary, the individual must consent to receiving the vaccine. And then one other wrinkle would be in union environments that you may have to bargain the vaccination because it may be deemed to be a term and condition of employment and not necessarily what's called a management right for purposes of mandating that in the workplace. The other thing is, and this is the crossover between employment and healthcare, a lot of these issues are, but the vaccination records should be, and related inquiries and the documents associated with that should be treated as confidential medical records. Jay, I'm surprised Jay has as much hair as he does, because he pulls his hair out when people misunderstand HIPAA all the time. This is not necessarily a HIPAA issue. This is more an ADA issue with regard to confidential medical records. And that's HR professionals know that they are to be segregated and kept secure in the workplace.
Jim, and one question that came in and that I've been receiving a lot, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, not to put you on the spot, but one question is, even if we're not mandating the vaccine, can we track, who of our staff has received it? And because we think managers should know, or we think certain people should be able to track it just so we can feel comfortable and others can feel comfortable. How have you been advising clients on that issue?
One, because I mean, following earlier precedent from the ADA, but two, recent guidance that came out from the EEOC that said, indeed, asking whether or not someone has been vaccinated or asking them to provide proof of vaccination is not deemed to be an inappropriate inquiry under the ADA. So in other words, employers can do it. Now, Andrew Yang, who's now running for mayor in New York City, but who was a candidate for president in the last election, had proposed that those that get vaccinated wear a certain color mask, because again, after you receive the vaccine for a period of time, you still shouldn't be wearing PPE until such time the vaccine has basically created that immunity in the body. That's a scary concept, and I think he got a lot of pushback in that regard. Whether it's wearing a red mask or something else, or wearing like a sticker on your lapel or button that says, you know, I voted or I'm vaccinated. That's one that's a little bit different. But can you ask employees or new employees if they've received the vaccine? If it's job related and so on, the answer is yes, you can, but you have to be careful not to tread into other areas where you shouldn't be asking. Again, the legal issues associated with the vaccination are under the Americans with Disabilities Act, again, job related, and that's important, consistent with business necessity or justified by direct threat. It really is as simple as that analysis. And you say, well, it's really not that simple when I look at the scope and diversity of my workplace. But again, it's no broader or no more intrusive than necessary. So you go back to, is it truly job related, meaning the vaccine? And is it consistent with our overall business necessity and the micro dealing with that department or that function? And if the person is, and if the answer is yes to each of those, and if the person is not vaccinated, this is a sort of further confirmation that the person represents a direct threat to coworkers, to themselves, and to others, then there is no reasonable accommodation. So then you have to go in a different route where they may not be able to stay in that job until such time that you determine, or the CDC determines, or the state determines that the person can return to work. Reasonable accommodations should indeed be considered. And again, if the person opts out or refuses. Now we're seeing a lot more of that. Yesterday I was dealing with accommodations, Jay, in the healthcare setting in assisted living facilities. Mm-hmm. And the person has to fill out a form that, of course, we've drafted and shared with clients that talks about, if it is a sincerely held religious belief, name the denomination and get this notarized. Now, does that have to be notarized by a priest, a minister, a rabbi, a shaman, whatever? No, it could be just a notary public, but you are swearing and attesting to the fact that it is the doctrine of, and we'll talk about that in a second, of my church. And it is a sincerely held belief, not just I'm adopting it today just to cover and duck out of the vaccine. But is it a reasonable accommodation under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, that's where the religion exemption is, or under the ADA, that's where the medical or disability exception is. So the religious exemption, it's a sincerely held belief, and meaning that it goes from the doctrine, the dogma, the very foundation of the religion. And again, you may adopt it that day, but and you don't have to say on a scale of 1 to 10, this is how religious I am, and this is how frequently I attend church, and so on. But it should be a part of that. Now, yesterday, questions came up. One was Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Seventh-day Adventist. Those were the 3 examples from yesterday. And actually, in all 3 cases, vaccines are not prohibited as a part of the doctrine of that church. And in Seventh-day Adventist, it is you make the decision yourself. Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic not prohibited, meaning that is not a roadblock to receiving the vaccine. Now, the employee may say, well, I still have opposition and I'm a spiritual person. Well, that doesn't necessarily fit in because it's not doctrine or established by the religion. Again, it's a sincerely held belief that conflicts with the job requirement, meaning the vaccine being a job requirement, and I can't take this and still do the job. So you're obligated to reasonably accommodate, you as an employer, reasonably accommodate the employee who raises the religious exemption. Now, again, my caution there is don't say, well, look, seriously, I'm Catholic and it doesn't apply to me. I wouldn't necessarily do that. My view would be if the person says that, then the other part of the analysis is, so don't necessarily dig into the bug dust of the religious doctrine. You don't need to do that. You don't need to become an instant expert. Instead, if the person says it and they say it is a sincerely held belief, then you basically go through the analysis of, okay, is there a reasonable accommodation? And it's more than just that minimal burden on the business. It means truly that the person cannot perform the job with this accommodation. Again, what could the accommodation be? It could be transfer to another department. It could be a shift change. It could be a job sharing. It could be working remotely, or it could be taking time off under PTO or an unpaid furlough for a period of time. The disability or medical exemption is a little bit different, and that is I'm avoiding because of a physical or mental impairment, and that's the interactive process under the ADA that talks about an exchange of information. It's not just because I said so, meaning the employer said so, or it's because the employee says, I request this accommodation. No, it's an exchange of information, and the employer does not have to accept the employee or the employee's physician's requested accommodation. However, they should be considered, and it should be back and forth. And basically the answer is, it is not a reasonable accommodation if it represents either a direct threat or an undue hardship. And the undue hardship is defined by the ADA guidance as cost and effect upon the organization, cost or effect upon the organization. A word of caution, if you focus on the cost, well, I have to hire more people, or we simply can't afford to do that, or I can't buy a laptop to have the person work remotely, and so on. If you do that and it's challenged, you could have to open up your books to show all the things that you spend your money on. So the better approach to these cases generally is to say the effect upon the organization. If we allow this, then it's going to disrupt this whole department. Others will have to cover, but that changes. There may be a related cost, but it just basically gets to be very disruptive. But that should be, again, a documented back and forth with the employee. And again, you're not going to say, well, we treat all people the same way. No, it's based upon the individualized analysis of that person's physical impairment, that person's mental impairment, and what it means in the job.
So I think suffice it to say, Jim, you can't rely upon a slippery slope argument. And if we did it for you, we'd have to do it for everybody, right?
Right. Or the example that was in class when we were in school, did you bring enough for the rest of the class? You know,
Right.
No, it really has to be that individualized analysis. And that's where we are right now. Jay said he's been dealing with clients on that. I've been dealing with clients on that. That's where we are right now with the back and forth. And it comes up in the religious, it comes up in the medical disability, but it's also coming up in, I don't want to get it. And so the statistic that Jay raised earlier, there are some people that are just afraid to receive it. I was talking to a physician the other day who's 76 years old, and he's working in a workplace where he could be exposed to patients with COVID. And he said, I choose to work remotely. But he said, even if I go back to work, I understand that they could require my vaccination, but I don't want the vaccination. I want to wait a couple of months to see what the true side effects are. And perhaps you get to that point, there's herd immunity, I don't need it anyway. They're just some people. And there's also a lot of bad science out there, or just bad information out there about the vaccine, you know, that how it came about, what's included in it, what the long-term effects could be, and so on. There are some that's not known, but these have gone through fairly rigorous testing. The 3 or 4 vaccines now, that two approved, a third that's about to be approved. But if the person says, no, I don't believe in vaccines, or I just choose not to receive it, then you have the same analysis, whether or not that person can stay in the job. And the last thing I'm going to cover very quickly here is other workplace considerations, and that is if it's a union environment, and you'll see more activity under this administration in that regard, and that's not a political statement or partisan statement. That's just that is actually what is one of the priorities of this this administration, to invest more in union workplaces and union protections under the National Labor Relations Act and so on. So in New Hampshire, there are not many private sector unions. you see more in the public sector for sure, meaning state, county, and local government. But whether it's public or private, the question is, if you have a union setting, is the employer obligated to negotiate about the vaccination policy or its impact of the policy? And the answer is, yeah, generally I think it is. While there is a management rights clause that exists in most collective bargaining agreements, it's terms and conditions of employment. So you would be best to do that, especially is, and this is kind of important, especially is, I would say, if there are incentives, and I want to talk about that later, but as an alternative to mandating, if you provide incentives, is that something that should be negotiated? So I'm going to switch back to Jay now, but that's something that's been talked about in the last couple of days.
Thanks, Jim. So we've talked a lot about notice and consent under the EUA. I think suffice it to say here, if you, like some of our employer clients, to decide to facilitate vaccination on site or off site through a third-party vendor, you want to make sure that that vendor, who's ever administering the vaccines to your employees, is distributing the EUA approved or the FDA approved drug fact sheet. That's where the known benefits and risks are mentioned. That's where it expressly states the option to refuse and the consequences in the case of opt-out. A number of our clients that have facilitated that outside vaccination have utilized, in addition to requiring the vendor to have their own drug fact sheet, they've asked us to prepare sort of information sheets or consents whereby they're just kind of reiterating, this is voluntary, it's not a term and condition of your employment. If you decide to do it, that's your call, etc. So it's something to consider if you're going to facilitate on-site or off-site vaccination of employees. A few other healthcare issues to consider, because I'm the healthcare guy. As Jim mentioned, healthcare facilities often require staff to get flu, hepatitis B, MMR, varicella, Tdap vaccines. That's obviously because healthcare personnel work in an environment where they could expose others or they could be exposed. And, you know, pre this pandemic, it was, I think, pretty understood that vaccination programs are an essential component of healthcare facilities' infection prevention and control efforts. But as Jim, I think Jim's example of the physician you spoke to, and I work with a lot of doctors and dentists, and I've heard similar reservation from some, you know, as these statistics show, you know, like this one here, only a third of a panel of 13,000 nurses said they'd take it voluntarily. Granted, that was back in October. So perhaps that number, if those willing to take it, is going up. And I think some recent articles show that, but some are saying, hey, I don't want to be a, you know, I don't want to be a guinea pig. I'm going to wait to see the side effects of these vaccines. And as Jim mentioned about HIPAA, although I still have some hair, it's going pretty gray. So I am generally the HIPAA guy and get lots of questions from my healthcare clients who are clearly HIPAA covered entities about the HIPAA privacy rule, security rule, breach notification rule. But generally as an employer, HIPAA does not apply to you. You're a covered entity under HIPAA if you're a healthcare provider, if you're a health insurance company, or you're a healthcare clearinghouse and you process claims. So generally speaking, the COVID-19 vaccine and vaccine efforts does not change the HIPAA analysis. However, you know, employers should not be looking at their group health insurance claim to determine if employees are vaccinated. That it's conceivable that that could violate HIPAA rules. And then GINA as well, genetic information testing. Title II of GINA is not implicated when an employer administers a vaccine or requires an employee to prove that they've received it, because it doesn't involve the use of genetic information to make employment decisions. Jim talked a lot about the direct threat analysis. In the interest of time, we'll move on, but just, you know, remember, you have to utilize these factors looking at, you know, how long is the risk? We're in the midst of a pandemic, so that's an undetermined nature and severity of potential harm to the person, to your staff, your customers, your patients, likelihood that the potential harm will occur and the imminence of the potential harm. A lot of those factors, it's tough to determine. So really look at those job functions as Jim mentioned. And yeah, Jim's already covered this, you know, just in terms of ensuring that you know, if you got to look to see whether there's a reasonable accommodation that can be provided to reduce the risk. Think about, make sure as you're thinking through the direct threat analysis and whether you need to provide a reasonable accommodation or whether it's even possible, consider CDC and OSHA guidelines as well as infection control policies and other rules and guidelines when making that decision about whether a reasonable accommodation is possible. And as Jim mentioned, if a direct threat cannot be reduced to an acceptable level, you may prevent your employee from entering the workplace and in certain circumstances be able to terminate them. But make sure you work through those issues carefully with counsel. So I think as Jim hinted, and I know there's been some questions in the Q&A, if we're not going to mandate it, can we provide incentives for employees to get the vaccine? And the short answer is yes. Somebody had asked about, in the Q&A, can we encourage people, put up a bulletin board recognizing those who've been vaccinated or kind of cheering those on, or you've seen a lot of organizations posting pictures on social media of their frontline healthcare workers getting the vaccine. I don't think there's any problem there, but you got to be careful about challenges from those who received a religious or medical exemption. Jim, did you have anything further to add on I don't know what you've been seeing in terms of employers asking you about incentives?
Yeah, so there've been a lot, Jay. What we've been seeing is, I'm thinking of examples of Dollar General is providing a cash benefit. There have been other employers on New Hampshire Labor Net that have said they've done the same. If you look at the EEOC Wellness Guide of a few years ago, under wellness programs, whether or not employers could offer certain cash or health insurance incentives for those that joined, Overeaters Anonymous, smoke enders, joined an exercise routine, and so on. And there were challenges, but EEOC did come out finally and say you can have provide a positive incentive to those that participate. You just can't penalize those who don't. People that have certain body mass index or that continue to smoke or use drugs or alcohol and so on. So as long as it isn't punitive, but this raises a very interesting question. So if I provide the incentive, and as an aside, and for those on this webinar know that over the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of time working on the issue of marijuana in the workplace. I never inhaled, but I worked on the issue. But the issue came up yesterday. An employer in actually a dispensary in Michigan is offering an incentive to people to get the vaccine. If you can show proof of getting the vaccine, you receive one marijuana joint. And they thought, well, is that illegal? Well, it's legal in Michigan, but that's an interesting approach. I do not recommend it. Jay, I think we were of the same voice. We do not recommend it.
I think we're on lockstep in that one, Jim.
So there are a lot of employers that are providing additional days of paid time off, a cash incentive, or facilitating it by saying, we'll give you paid time off to receive the vaccine, or actually you're still clocked in and you can get the vaccine on premises. Here's the problem that has not been addressed yet. What about those individuals who have taken the exemption for religious, medical, or disability, but they don't get the incentive because they've got that exemption? Is that a form of discrimination? That has not been answered yet. I think the short answer to that would be no. We're not discriminating against you because of that. We're providing that, again, wellness incentive to those that were able to get the vaccination. And I think it's going to fall into the area of the pandemic exception. But that's something to be considered down the road. And I think we've answered that one. Can you ask employees if they've been vaccinated? The short answer is yes. It's not an improper inquiry, but you shouldn't attempt to elicit more information.
Jim, and one of the questions in the Q&A was, can we require employees to submit proof of vaccination for tracking? And now we kind of talked about tracking, but I don't know that we expressly hit on give me the proof. Yeah,
and the answer is yes, you can. At least that's what EEOC says at this point. So it isn't just, yes, I did. I'll show you where I got it in the arm. We'd prefer proof. Again, if it goes back to, it's a job requirement consistent with business necessity for purposes of protecting coworkers and others. So alternatives to the vaccine, and something I think Jay mentioned earlier, I talked about it as well, moving the employee to a different job, remote work, at least for a period of time. I had a client yesterday, Jay, that said they're going to furlough some of these employees that have exempted out until late March or early April. And it's job related and consistent with business necessity. They're not firing them. Now, here's the question: whether or not that the voluntary receipt of the vaccine, if the person says, I want to opt out, and you say, okay, well, I'll furlough you until late March or early April, and the person says, okay, I'll receive the vaccine. That's kind of interesting. And again, it has to be, as Jay said, knowing and voluntary consent to the vaccine.
Right. I was under duress. You told me I wasn't going to be able to work. It wasn't voluntary. And then I had an adverse reaction.
Right. And that's why the notice is important. And I think it also is critical that it indeed be job related and consistent with business necessity. And there are no other alternatives. And the alternatives, again, might be insisting on new or enhanced PPE, as Jay said, or additional safety practices. It might be remote work. It might be moving the employee to a different workspace and segregating them, or it might be, again, furlough or leave. But termination should be the last option. Consistency, hobgoblin of little minds, perhaps, but it's also one that will shield employers from issues. Now, again, it is not, we always do it the same way with regard to this type of disability. No, it has to be an individualized analysis, but consistently with regard to your opt-out, whether or not you mandate it, whether for certain jobs or all jobs, how you are exercising or using your opt-out practices, what your record keeping is, and the treatment of employees who opt out or refuse the vaccine, being reasonably consistent. And again, the best practices. Jay, I'm going to flip this back to you.
Sure. Yep, absolutely, Jim. Sorry to cut you off. So, make sure to, as you've seen, I mean, since Jim and I have, we talked about, since we've been doing this webinar, or not exactly this webinar, but, different webinars on COVID-19 vaccination issues and testing issues, the guidance drops nearly every week. So, make sure to stay up to date with CDC, DHHS, FDA guidance. Keep an eye out for FDA full licensure, which some are saying might be happening in March or April for those vaccines, because that will change the analysis. The EUAs Jim and I talked about require you to give the ability to opt out. We'll see how that changes. Make sure to create or update your COVID-19 policies for your workplace to include vaccination requirements if applicable. Be sure notice and consent guidelines are followed. Continue to follow recommended workplace safety policies. If the vaccination is required or encouraged, be careful to avoid those improper and irrelevant inquiries that might put you in trouble under the ADA. Engage employees in an interactive accommodation process. That's really that you get down into the dust on what accommodations might be required or necessary. Maintain confidential records to the extent you're receiving them. Be flexible. This is, as you know, it changes almost daily, and so there's going to be a need to shift and be flexible in order to keep your workplace safe. Stay safe. We hope brighter days are ahead.
So we've got some questions as we wrap up today, and thank you all for joining us. And thank you also for putting up with my double espresso this morning as I race through my stuff. Jay knows, and others on here know that I'm a fast talker anyway. So let's go through a couple of these questions. It says, not sure if I'm addressed, but curious about paying for employees to get the vaccine. We're not mandating it, but it's highly encouraged. I think the answer is you certainly can encourage it. You can provide incentives. Again, it's going to go back to whether or not the person properly refuses or opts out, and whether or not there's going to be any adverse employment consequence for them opting out, or you're just if it's available. And again, the thing there is, Jay talked about the stages we're in. We're only in stage 1B. So really, the employers right now that are providing, either mandating or providing incentives to get the vaccine are for those that actually their population could get the vaccine. And it would be healthcare facilities, first responders, and so on, and perhaps even schools. We are defining job related. How are we defining job related in this case? We never had a job description that read vaccine required. Maybe, Jay, in the healthcare setting, in hospitals, licensed positions, it may, I think you've seen that before.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
In the healthcare setting, we've seen, even if not in the employment contract, just kind of as part of the onboarding packet notification that that's required, and you need to submit proof of your immunizations. And I think to the point of this question, if you're not in the healthcare setting, I think the point about being job related is just really focusing on that particular employee's, for each category of employees, their job functions, how much are they interacting with the public, how much are they interacting with other employees, is there any risk of exposure to others, and just being deliberate and careful about analyzing what measures are required or best practice to keep everybody safe.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Could it become discrimination? The question asked, those who are not vaccinated versus those that are vaccinated. And I talked about Andrew Yang's example and so on. I don't think you wear the badge V on the employee, whether they're vaccinated or not. Again, it's going to come down to business necessity and job related, whether they're vaccinated or not. So I don't see that as a form of discrimination. Does the employer have any liability if they ask or mandate employees get the vaccine and the employee has an adverse reaction? Jay, I think you just talked about that. Doesn't that come back to the producer of the vaccine and the notice they provide with regard to the possible side effects and the expected benefits, and whether or not it's a voluntary consent?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's been a lot of talk, as folks on the webinar know, about, different liability shields for employers, state law or policy, et cetera. But I think you're right, Jim. I think, the EUA does allow for the opt-out at this time. And presumably, if somebody had an adverse reaction, the employer and or the vaccine maker, manufacturer will be pointing back to the fact sheet that they handed out that said, we don't know enough. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. And it's your choice under those circumstances. I mean, conceivably, if you mandated it and somebody said, well, I've read the fact sheet and I'm not going to do it, that's their choice, right? Then, I mean, there's a consequence to that choice, but that's their choice.
Right. I like this question. This is pretty unique. Is it okay to post pictures of employees receiving the vaccine? Isn't this in opposition to keeping confidential medical records? Like anything else in the workplace, I will tell you that if you're taking pictures of anyone, whether it's a video or a still image, get their consent, especially if you're going to publish it in any way, shape, or form. But yeah, I tread lightly in that regard. But if the person says, like a blood bank issue or otherwise, I consent to getting my picture taken and using it for sort of promoting the benefits of getting the vaccine, yeah, perhaps. But that in and of itself is not a confidential medical record. Right. But it is potentially an invasion of privacy when you capture someone's image. It really gets to whether or not there's any pecuniary benefit to the employer in doing that. But to me, I think it's a safe practice to say, get someone's consent before you publish their image. Generally speaking, maybe I'll speak for myself. I don't like having my picture taken because it's a shock in reality when I see what I really look like. In my mind, I look like Fabio, but the reality of it is that is not the case. So, or it's like any other picture that's taken, you think, oh my God, I need to go on a diet. Again, personalizing this. Get consent, I would. And
so there's another question here about New Hampshire has not yet specifically identified the availability of the vaccine for essential workers. Do you see this changing anytime soon? I think, a lot of essential healthcare workers have received it. I know there's been a big push by Governor Sununu and the Biden administration to get the vaccines out. But yet we've seen there's a lot of availability problems. So I think it's just time's going to tell how long it takes for everybody to get it that wants it and needs it. And especially since we just had 200,000, 65-year-old plus folks sign up, and it's going to probably be a little while for them to get it.
This is a little off the beam, Jay, but as we're winding up today, just a quick question for you. Have you seen this yet? Because I've been hearing more and more about this. Because of the fragility of the vaccine, meaning it has to be stored at a certain temperature, and then once it's taken out of that, it's only good for X number of hours, and people are not showing up for their appointments, either their first or second dose, and there is the potential for wasting. Have you seen it where individuals rather, can contact either their physician or to a hospital to say, I would like to get on the list to avoid it being wasted?
No, I haven't heard of that. I mean, I've certainly heard of those stories of the hospital CEO prioritized, his daughter to get it, and the community is outraged, but I've not heard about the wasting issues. There was an not about being able to get on a list, I should say, but I did see an article yesterday about somebody that was transporting the vaccine on the highway, and they got caught in a snowstorm, and this whole road was kind of wiped out. There's a bunch of people on it, and they walked up and down to the cars asking, hey, do you want this vaccine? Because it's going to expire. So whole host of issues there, but it's interesting for sure.
I think I was in traffic like that this morning.
Yeah.
And had I known, instead of getting the double espresso, I could have had either the Pfizer or Moderna.
Right.
We have an employee who is a staunch anti-vaxxer, and that is covered under. Is that covered under the ADA? And the answer is no. No, it's not, unless it's a true medical or disability reason where the person could be harmed by getting the vaccine. And that comes from their healthcare provider. But that one, and I wanted to mention that, is that when the person says, I have a disability or a medical condition, that has to be supported by a doctor's note that indeed says that is an issue. So someone who's just simply being an anti-vaxxer is not covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Says she is also very vocal about it. Can we ask her to curtail communicating her employees with their beliefs company-wide? She has sent a couple of emails about how to know your employer can't force you to get the vaccine. That's in part the problem with social media and the access to information. There's a lot of misinformation out there. As an employer, can you control what employees put out on the company-wide email system? Yes, you can, but we don't want to be those that are necessarily censoring our employees, especially if they're communicating valid concerns about terms and conditions of employment. This is under the National Labor Relations Act. But I would have a candid conversation, say, look, if you've got this concern, let's have a discussion. And I have had employers that have had town meetings with all their employees to talk about their approach to the vaccine, whether it's mandatory or encouraged. But I think if this individual is spreading misinformation that is potentially disruptive to the workplace, you can certainly discipline, but proceed with caution, because if she's speaking for herself, that's one thing. If she's speaking on behalf of others, it could be considered to be protected concerted activity under the National Labor Relations Act. So I would just simply have a discussion with the person, say, let's understand your concerns. And if you choose not to get the vaccine, that's perfectly fine. But here are the reasons why either we're mandating it or we're encouraging it. And we have just time for one or two more questions. We talked about the wellness incentive already. That question came up. And you can, in fact, have a wellness issue. And then, should employers consider the long view if considering requiring vaccinations? In other words, the precedent sets. Could they find themselves in a position where new strains come and they aren't covered by the current vaccine, and therefore have to require employees to get more and more vaccinations? Is this a slippery slope? What do you think, Jay?
I mean, it's certainly an individualized call. I think we find ourselves in a pretty unprecedented situation right now, right, in terms of this pandemic. So it's really, I think it's a personal, it's a preference on behalf of the business owner. Also, I think it depends on the type of business, and back to that job-related business necessity risk assessment. So yeah, it's hard to make that call. I don't know that from a legal perspective there's any problem, with requiring it now, but not requiring it later.
No, in fact, one of the articles I read recently, Jay, said that this COVID-19 is going to prepare us for what's next, the next pandemic. And that in some ways could be a good thing, in that we are better prepared next time, perhaps. But yeah, I think it depends upon the workplace, because again, in Jay's practice, dealing with hospitals and other healthcare providers, they may indeed require it as a part of the job. Again, yeah. Job requirement and business necessity. Yeah,
and it may be ensconced in law, not too far from now, once the EUA once the vaccine gets full licensure. Well, we appreciate you all hanging in there with us as we've gone a little bit over time, but we wanted to make sure we answered all your questions. We sincerely appreciate you attending. Thank you very much. Please reach out. Our contact information is at the end of the presentation here. I will turn it back over to Emily, but thank you again for this wonderful opportunity to partner with the Chamber. Thanks, Jim. Always a pleasure presenting with you. Thanks, Jay.
Well, thank you all. I snuck in a question in our little private chat. I don't know if you've time to answer it while I pull up this screen share I'm going to do. But for employers who do not want to mandate the vaccine for whatever reason, can you talk about how employees may react to that? Do they have leverage in complaining that they are not safe in the workplace? I don't know if you can quickly address this, and I'll get my last slide up here.
Yeah, so that does come up, Emily, and has come up even before the vaccine was there. You know, you go back to March of 2020 when stay-at-home orders were in place and businesses were shuttering and they were furloughing employees, and then gradually allowing employees to come back with certain densities in the workplace and so on. But there were a number of employees who were either on unemployment or on PTO or otherwise that said, I don't feel safe coming back to the workplace, and the assurances the employer had to provide. Now that the vaccine is out, they're saying, why don't you mandate? And we'll only return if you mandate it. Going back again to the spring and summer of last year, a lot of employees said, I'm not coming back until there's a vaccine. Well, they don't have that excuse anymore if they're eligible to get the vaccine. But in that case, as Jay said, the employee is making a choice. And if it's something that we cannot accommodate their absence from the workplace for weeks or months, or we cannot have them work remotely, then they may not have a job anymore. So it really is like anything else. It's having a discussion, understanding a back and forth, and then ultimately making a decision, but not having a knee-jerk reaction to someone, because there's a lot of good reasons and there are a lot of bad reasons for not receiving the vaccine, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I think the way in which you deal with it is having a frank, direct conversation with the individual and then making the ultimate decision.
Emily, you're on mute, just so you know.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you guys again for being here today. Thank you to She and Finney for sponsoring this. Jason and Jim, we really appreciate this great overview you gave of this very difficult, complicated issue. So really briefly, because I know we're a little late, I just want to share a little bit about what the Chamber is doing. We are the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce, the state capital state Chamber of Commerce. We, along with webinars like this, and we do record them so you can go back and see what we've done in the past. We do virtual networking events. It's a great way to kind of build your professional network during this time. They are a lot of fun. We have an economic forecast forum coming up. You may want to put that on your calendar. We have a great speaker for that. Again, you can look at past webinars. We have a great sort of HR mental health in the workplace webinar series. You may want to watch those videos. It's a great resource. And then if you want to learn more about becoming a Chamber member, we would be happy to talk to you, share some information about our mission and what we do in the community. So go to our website, contact us. I did plug in the email there for our membership coordinator, you know, if you'd like to get in touch with her. But thank you so much to everyone who could join today. And again, thank you so much, Jason and Jim, for being here.
Thanks, Emily.
All right, have a good day, everyone.